Thank you very much, Ian, and thank you all for joining us today. I work as a research scientist for the Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research, which is the science arm of Ducks Unlimited Canada. And just my name is on the title slide, but I'm actually going to be presenting the work of a number of individuals who I will introduce you to through the course of the presentation. But just know that there are a lot of people who've contributed to this, and I wanted to thank them up front for their contributions to the science and also contributing slides and photos to the presentation. So for those of you who aren't familiar with Ducks Unlimited Canada, our mission is to conserve, restore, and manage wetlands and associated habitats for North America's waterfowl. These habitats benefit other wildlife, people, and our environment. One of the benefits that we derive from habitat conservation can be climate mitigation. So habitat conservation is a form of natural climate solutions. And although natural climate solutions are not a replacement for decarbonization, numerous analyses, including the one you see on the screen, suggest that natural climate solutions do hold promise for meeting our climate mitigation goals. Another benefit flowing from habitat conservation are their biodiversity co-benefits. So we are in the midst of two global crises, climate change and biodiversity loss, and there is understandable interest in how we use limited resources to tackle both simultaneously, with habitat conservation offering promise on both sides. So on the subject of limited resources, if you watched Paige Olmsted's webinar in this webinar series recently, they highlighted the biodiversity funding gap. So basically, current levels of investment in global biodiversity conservation are far below what we know they need to be, to the tune of about $700 billion US. And that's just the biodiversity funding gap. My guess would be that if you add climate on top of that, the financing gap becomes even larger. This is driving, of course, our interest in new sources of investment. And recent PHJV policy webinars have highlighted some of the hurdles that exist. There are, of course, lots of individuals and organizations working on this. I've highlighted here the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosures. There's the related Task Force on Nature-Related or Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, and the International Sustainability Standards Board. So these are organizations that are working to establish standards for sustainability disclosures and reporting designed to meet the needs of investors and financial markets. Now, I am not an economist. This is not the sphere that I work in. I don't work on the finance details. What I and my colleagues at the Institute for Wetland and Waterfowl Research do is a lot of work on quantifying ecosystem services. So the benefits we derive from nature to provide foundational data and scientific tools to enable investments in conservation. And today I want to tell you about 3 projects that our group is leading. Some of these projects are ongoing. One is recently completed, to give you a sense of how we are trying to contribute to enabling greater investment in nature conservation. The first project I want to talk about is a national research network that is co-led by Dr. Irina Creed at the University of Toronto Scarborough and my colleague Dr. Pascal Badiou at Ducks Unlimited Canada. This network involves a number of Ducks Unlimited Canada staff, as well as academics at universities all across the country. So this project, Wetlands as Nature-Based Climate Change Solutions, seeks to develop authoritative estimates for rates of organic carbon accumulation, greenhouse gas fluxes to the atmosphere, and carbon transports into and out of freshwater mineral soil wetlands. A few years ago, Pascal worked with Ronnie Drever and others to assess the potential for nature-based climate solutions in Canada. Avoided conversion of freshwater mineral soil wetlands was one of the measures that they assessed. So the figure you see on the screen comes from their scientific paper, and the green box surrounds the avoided wetland conversion measure. So the gray box gives us a sense of the magnitude of the climate mitigation potential. But note that the thin line through the box, which represents the error bars, are quite large. And in essence, this project seeks to shrink those error bars and give us more precise estimates. It also seeks to improve the estimates that go into Canada's national greenhouse gas inventory. So this is a large national scale project. I'm not going to talk about all of it. Instead, I'll really highlight the portion that Ducks Unlimited Canada is leading. So this project builds on a previously funded carbon study where we started using this sophisticated equipment called eddy covariance flux towers to measure greenhouse gas fluxes from wetlands. So this is a type of micrometeorology equipment that allows us to continuously measure greenhouse gas fluxes from the whole wetland in a very integrated fashion. The photo you see on the left is a picture of one of our flux towers. It's basically some scaffolding with greenhouse gas sensors and various micrometeorological equipment attached. And we started off with 2 flux towers. So one is embedded in a wetland that is surrounded by pasture. That's the photo on the left. And then the photo on the right is the equipment in a wetland that is surrounded by annual cropland. And those 2 flux towers are in southwest Manitoba, so just northeast of Brandon. And we've recently added a 3rd flux tower, this time deployed at Oakhammock Marsh, which is a large restored wetland and where the Ducks Unlimited Canada national headquarters are. So flux towers are great and have helped us overcome some methodological limitations that we've had previously in measuring wetland greenhouse gases, but they are expensive, so you can only have so many, and the Prairies is a large region. So we are complementing the use of flux tower technology with more traditional wetland greenhouse gas sampling, which allows us to get to a greater number of sites. So at these sort of survey sites, we are sampling the diffusive open water fluxes and using some traditional sort of chamber-based measurements. The photo on the top right is my colleague Brian measuring greenhouse gas fluxes using a custom chamber that is placed over emergent vegetation. So within the Prairies, we now have sampled in at least 1 year around 100 wetlands. And this year in 2024, we're actually expanding to areas in southern Alberta to increase the geography we cover. And then last year, we've also expanded this kind of sampling to new geographies. So my colleague Lee Van Arden is leading some sampling in the interior of BC, and my colleague Brian Page is leading some sampling in southwestern Ontario. So as I mentioned, the strength of the flux towers is they provide this sort of continuous monitoring of the wetland, and we get a picture of the whole wetland. So in particular, what's significant is you get both fluxes from the open water areas of wetlands, but also from the vegetation, which is very important from a carbon perspective. In the top panel of this figure, what you're seeing is net ecosystem exchange through time. And net ecosystem exchange is the balance between the primary production of the wetland and the respiration of carbon. And so what you're seeing essentially is the net effect of the CO2 flux. And what you can see is that the 2 wetlands have some coherent patterns. In particular, we see strong seasonal patterns where in the summer we have this uptake of CO2 as the vegetation is really vigorous and growing, and then some emission of CO2 from the wetland during the shoulder seasons and the winter months. In contrast, the bottom panel shows us the fluxes of the greenhouse gas methane. And here we see differences between the 2 wetlands. So the wetland pictured in yellow, the hog wetland, is the one that is embedded in pasture. And we can see that that wetland typically has very low methane fluxes, whereas the young wetland, which is surrounded by annual cropland, has seasonal patterns in methane fluxes where we have these peak emissions during the summer months. So the flux towers have provided some useful information about 2 wetlands, and now we can turn to our wetland survey to understand whether or not these patterns hold more broadly. And briefly, thank you to Dr. Sarah Knox from McGill for sharing this figure and helping us work up the flux tower data. So these next figures have been provided by Dr. Laura Lagozzo, who is a postdoc in Dr. Matt Bogard's lab at the University of Lethbridge. And from the left-hand panel, you can see that the patterns we see in the flux towers, where wetlands surrounded by cropland have higher total greenhouse gas fluxes, holds true in the broader set of wetlands. So basically what we've got stacked here is the CO2 emissions, methane emissions, and then a very thin sliver of blue for nitrous oxide emissions from wetlands. This is just the open water portion. And basically we have higher total emissions on average from wetlands surrounded by cropland than those in pasture, and that's driven by greater methane emissions. The panels on the right-hand side are showing you the concentration of methane versus various water chemistry variables. So in the middle panel, total phosphorus, and on the right-hand panel, sulfate, which is an ion that is related to the salinity or salt content of the wetland. And what you can see is that in general, wetlands that are situated in cropland, which are the orange dots, tend to have higher nutrients and oftentimes lower salinity, lower salt content, and salt content helps suppress methane production. So we think that the differences we see in methane fluxes are being driven by these underlying differences in the nutrient and salt content of wetlands embedded in cropland versus those embedded in some kind of perennial cover like pasture or hay or idled grassland. So these are preliminary results from this study. Field sampling is ongoing. We have a couple more years of data collection. So stay tuned for additional findings as we work to refine our understanding of wetland fluxes in the prairies and expand to new geographies. The next project I want to tell you about is the biodiversity mapping and assessment tool. I am fortunate to get to collaborate on this work. It's a project led by my colleague, Dr. James Patterson, who's in the top left photo there, with support from Paige Cowell, Jim DeBreeze, and Ash Pidwer-Besky. So we know that biodiversity loss is declining faster than at any time in human history, and the largest or the primary driver of this is changes in land and sea use. And in agricultural landscapes, we know that landscape simplification reduces biodiversity, but then the flip side is true, that habitat restoration can bring back biodiversity, so that, biodiversity is dependent on having a variety of habitats in landscapes. And this tool really seeks to describe that relationship between habitats and biodiversity in order to create, models that can serve as a decision support tool. So we've done this modeling for the Prairie's ecozone, and we are modeling biodiversity as 329 vertebrate species. So amphibians, birds, mammals, and reptiles. We do the modeling at a quarter section scale, which is a fairly fine resolution and also a very management relevant scale. In order to build this tool, we used observations of where species occur, and this included both systematic monitoring data, but also citizen science data, so the kind of data you can get from, for example, iNaturalist, habitat data, such as the amount and size of habitat patches, which is derived from, publicly available land cover layers, and climate data on temperature and precipitation. We combined these data sources to build species distribution models for each of the 329 species, and these models basically predict the probability of each species occurring in a given location. So what you get are 329 different models, 329 different, spatial layers, these maps that we can stack and combine to get a overall biodiversity, species richness, number of species map for the prairies, where we can, identify, for example, biodiversity hotspots. We can, however, also use this tool to zoom in. So let's have a look at Western Manitoba. We have two quarter sections here that are less than 5 kilometers apart. And you can see the quarter section on the left is a cultivated field, but with patches of wetlands and trees remaining. And our tool predicts that we would find 136 species on that quarter section. Compare that to the quarter section on the right, where it is 100% cultivated. There's really no remaining patches of natural grass or wetlands. And our tool predicts only 71 species might occur on this quarter section. We can also use this tool to create biodiversity assessments or simulate how conservation programs will benefit biodiversity. So take this hypothetical example of a quarter section where about half of it is annual cropland, and then we have some habitat patches still on that quarter section. We're going to enroll that cropland in, for example, Ducks Unlimited Canada's forage program. We're going to convert the annual cropland to tame grass and ask the tool how that affects biodiversity. So, for example, we might have seen 83 total species beforehand, before conversion, and after conversion of annual cropland to tame grass, we see a 30% increase in the biodiversity and now have 108 total species driven by increases in both the mammals and the birds. So we have now completed the tool for the prairies and are now working on the next phase of the project, which is expanding this to Eastern Canada south of the Boreal. So more to come with hopefully new and expanded utility as we cover new geographies. The last project I want to tell you about is the Wetland Ecosystem Services tool. This is another decision support tool that we have developed for Ducks Unlimited Canada, and this is a large collaborative effort involving the efforts of Llewellyn Armstrong, Paige Cowell, Pascal Badiou, Lyle Boychuk, who's in our Prairie GIS department, Brian Page, James Patterson, Lee Van Arden, and Jim DeVries. When we talk about the benefits that we derive from wetlands, we often highlight that they help mitigate floods, that they purify water, that they store carbon, and provide habitat for more than just waterfowl. This tool is all about quantifying these benefits and putting it into a framework that can be used for conservation planning and decision making. Again, this tool is meant to cover the prairies, and we are modeling ecosystem services, including wetland volume, which we're using as a proxy for those water regulation functions, nutrient retention, carbon storage, and biodiversity support. Unlike the biodiversity tool, which operates at the quarter section scale, this is operating at 16 square mile grids, so that's 64 quarter sections. So it is meant to be a slightly coarser tool for decision making than the biodiversity tool. The data that drive this tool represent about 20 years of investment in ecosystem services research by Ducks Unlimited Canada. So the map you're seeing here shows you the location of the data that feeds into this tool. The watersheds in orange represent areas that contribute data to the nutrient retention module. So we've got Cameras Creek in Alberta, some of the Souris River watersheds, and then a number of watersheds in Manitoba that were actually sampled by our colleague, Dr. Henry Wilson at AFC. The area in blue is Cactus Lake, Saskatchewan, which contributes data to the wetland volume module. And then the two green watersheds are Smith and Broughton's Creek, which contribute data to both the wetland volume and nutrient modules. The red dots are the sites of wetlands that have been cored for the carbon module. And then finally, the biodiversity data come from all across the region because the biodiversity module is driven by the biodiversity tool that I just described. So we don't have time to go through how each of these modules were developed, but I will walk you through one example just to give you a sense of the process that we used to derive these different modules. So the nutrient retention module is driven by watershed scale nutrient monitoring data. So Pascal and Brian or Henry and his team would monitor water flows and nutrient concentrations at the outlets of either a sub-watershed or a watershed. And what that tells us about is all of the area upstream that contributes to the water flowing through that outlet. So in essence, usually in the spring, we have water moving across the landscape. That water is picking up nutrients from fields, and it's going to flow to a creek, to a stream, flow downstream to an outlet where we can then sample and derive information about the net effect of land cover and nutrient practices upstream. We have this kind of data for 172 watershed year combinations, and then we can try and build statistical models that ask, what variables explain variation in the observed nutrient export is what we'll call this. So what we found is that nitrogen export is influenced by the amount of runoff, the amount of wetlands in the watershed, the amount of cropland in the watershed, and the amount of trees in the watershed. The figure on the right just shows you the relationship with runoff and wetlands. So we have nitrogen export, so how much nitrogen is coming off the watershed versus the proportion wetland cover, so 0 to 100% wetland cover. And then the three lines show you three different levels of runoff. So we have higher export at greater levels of runoff. 200 millimeters annual runoff in the prairies would be a very wet year. 1 millimeter of runoff in the prairies is a drought year, and 25 millimeters of runoff in the prairies is, for many places, an average year. So we have higher export when we have more water, and we have higher export if we have less wetlands. So this is confirming what we know, that wetlands are good at intercepting nutrients and reducing the amount of nutrients that end up downstream. Now, there is actually, I will just add a little bit more to contextualize for those who are familiar with the prairies. Note that this graph displays wetland cover from 0 to 100%, but at the scale of 16 square mile grids, there are almost no grids that have 100% wetland cover. 98% of the area falls to the left of that vertical gray dashed line. So that's really the area to look at when you're thinking about wetland effects. So the modeling was done on nutrient export, and there is some additional calculations that has to happen to convert export to nutrient retention by wetlands. I won't walk through that process, but feel free to ask me about it later if you're really interested in the details. And what we then have is a model that we can use to predict nutrient retention by wetlands in any 16 square mile grid in the prairies, and produce a map like this. So this is total nitrogen retention in kilograms per year for the prairies with the PHJV priority areas overlain. You can see that there is strong spatial variation. We have areas in Alberta or Southwest Saskatchewan that are providing relatively little nutrient retention, and then areas in Western Alberta and at the edge, the northern edge of the prairies, that seem to be providing very high nitrogen retention services. These patterns are driven by the mean annual runoff of the area, but also by the land cover. So we would expect to see higher nitrogen retention values when we have more wetland and tree cover and less cropland. Now, I haven't walked you through how we created all these modules, but just know we have the same kind of map for the other ecosystem services. So top left is water volume, top right is phosphorus retention, bottom left is soil organic carbon, so just the stock, not the fluxes, and bottom right is wetland species richness. This is an in-progress project, so what's next for us is now stacking these different ecosystem services and looking at things like synergies between ecosystem services, trade-offs between ecosystem services, and also using spatial prioritization tools to ask questions about where we get our highest return on investment from conservation investments in wetland retention and wetland restoration. To wrap up, there are numerous benefits that flow from the conservation of waterfowl habitats. The benefits of wetland and grassland conservation have been long known. They are very well established scientifically, but there is specific utility in quantifying them. There is a big difference between saying wetlands filter water versus being able to say that wetlands remove, X tons of phosphorus each year that it would otherwise end up in Lake Winnipeg. Decision support tools that quantify services help us answer questions about how much and where conservation needs to happen, and we hope that they will eventually help underpin confidence in increasing investment in habitat conservation so that we are all collectively working towards reducing that funding gap for biodiversity and for the climate. With that, I will thank you all for your time. I'd like to thank the colleagues who contributed to the presentation, the many individuals who collected the field data that underlie this science, Dr. Henry Wilson for sharing his data, and of course, the many funders of the 3 projects I have presented.
Thank you, Lauren. That was a very interesting presentation. For those of you who have questions, please feel free to either raise your hand or type it in the chat. There were a couple questions that came in during the presentation itself. This is, I think, about the biodiversity model. Is the model simply an occurrence model, or is it an abundance model?
It is an occurrence model. It's the models produce a predicted probability of occurrence. The data that are available for this don't allow us to model abundance.
Stuart, go ahead.
Lauren, great presentation. I was curious, you haven't done the overlays yet, but what trade-offs in ecosystem services might you anticipate, given your understanding of the system? And how might we balance those from a conservation planning perspective?
Those are 2 very good questions, Stuart. So we know that there will be some trade-offs that exist because in the statistical models that drive these maps, there are fundamentally different underlying drivers. Sometimes there are commonalities. So land cover is a common theme from, biodiversity, carbon, nutrients. But for example, the nutrient retention functions is extremely driven by hydrology, which doesn't affect any of the other services. So we know we're setting ourselves up for some trade-offs to exist, for example, in that function. I think that when we think about how we maximize services, there are lots of challenging questions we have to answer. So first of all, climate and biodiversity are the 2 things that people are talking about most often. It seems to be the environmental challenges that most people are concerned with. And so you have to ask yourself, do you prioritize those functions, or do you treat all functions of wetlands equally? But one of the nice things about this tool is it allows you to use it in different ways. So, perhaps sometimes we ask the question about maximizing across all ecosystem services, but if you were interested, for example, specifically in, nutrient retention functions of wetlands, you can analyze just those data and prioritize those data. Sometimes we have good reason, if you're a funder, if you're a conservation organization, to have some specific function top of mind. So I'm not the right person to always be making those decisions, but what's nice about the tool is it gives us the flexibility to hopefully be useful in multiple avenues when different interested parties have different priorities that we can help satisfy.
Great, thanks.
Okay, we have had another question come in. Are the per area nutrient export coefficients across the entire gross watersheds, or just a 1 or 2 contributing areas?
So the the nutrient export data are based on, okay, I gotta walk through this per area. So they are, it depends on the map. So the kilogram per year estimates that you saw, those are just retention for wetland areas. The graph of the total nitrogen export would be for the sort of watershed area, but you're functionally only measuring the contributing areas. I'm not sure if I'm totally answering your question. Sorry, it's a very technical response, but in essence, the estimates, because you're measuring at the outlet, you are measuring the net effect of just the contributing areas.
Great, thank you. Jim, please feel free to ask your question.
Yeah, thanks. Great work, Lauren, and all your colleagues. This is fabulous stuff. It's something we've all been talking about for a long time, and great to have some data around it. And I'm just wondering if you're, when we're trying to frame a lot of this stuff up recently for protecting wetlands through term agreements, along with all the other great tools we have, kind of looking ahead, like I think this possibly could allow us to look at, say if, look at the current wetland rate of loss, the estimates for that, both in croplands and in pastured or whatever else you want to, the groupings of wetlands. But we know that in crop fields are, almost 3 times more vulnerable, or the estimates from Watmow. And kind of projecting, one of the things we've tried to do is look at say a 50-year time frame. And if you start looking out at a time frame like that and considering them as, kind of like an endangered species, an endangered or threatened ecosystem, and those kind of thoughts, it would be great to try and tease that out as well. Somehow I'd be interested in following up with you to see how we could kind of say, look, if it's status quo and we don't do more to protect wetlands over time, here's where we're going to end up. And I think when you look at those long time horizons, you get people's attention. One year it doesn't really grab you that much when it's less than 1% loss rates. And so anyway, I'd be keen to hear your response to that and how we might be able to help frame that up for policy, like decision makers. So
thanks, Jim. Yeah, I think that's a great point. What are the cumulative losses when we lose wetlands? And you're thinking a little bit on the same lines. Etienne has a question there. How do you think the prioritization tool can be integrated with risk of loss or cost of retention? And we are all sort of thinking along the same lines. So the reason that the Wetland Ecosystem Services tool runs on a 16 square mile grid is Ducks Unlimited Canada has a decision support tool we call the cost tool that integrates both risk of loss and cost of retention, time horizons for this. And the goal is to incorporate the Wetland Ecosystem Services information into that cost tool so that cost of conservation delivery, risk of loss become incorporated into there. So that is sort of one of the other things that's next on the horizon for this project. But I agree, Jim, that yes, we could absolutely use this to forecast multi-year effects of wetland loss. So thank you for pointing out specific use for the tool, because of course we do this research hoping that it will be useful.
absolutely, thank you.
To answer the question right before it, yes, the recording will be made available on the PHJV YouTube channel. Hopefully by the end of the day today, it'll be up and you can review this presentation and every other presentation of the PHJV webinar series. Well, if there aren't any more questions, I'd like to take this opportunity to thank Lauren again for her presentation. And I'd also like to thank everybody who took the time to attend this month's presentation. And we look forward to seeing everyone again next month for the next presentation in the BHJV. Oh, hold on. One more question. An interesting question will be raised by the ag industry. What is the trade-off of carbon lost by draining versus the increased methane from a wetland in cropland? How would you answer that?
That's a great question, Etienne. And the answer is, I think, a little bit complicated. This is something that I'm working on with some others to try and formally quantify this. But fundamentally, we treat anthropogenic emissions different from natural emissions. So basically, when we do climate accounting, carbon accounting, we do everything relative to a pre-industrial baseline. And so emissions that occurred before that baseline don't contribute to climate change. They contribute to the general greenhouse effect, which is necessary, but they don't contribute to climate change, and so aren't something we're looking to reduce. The draining of a wetland is an anthropogenic activity. So the carbon that gets mobilized when you drain the wetland, so all the carbon that's stored in the soil and gets turned into CO2 when it's converted, that all counts towards climate accounting, climate change, and is fair game for sort of management. There is increased methane from wetlands in croplands. And it's a little, we're still working on disentangling whether or not that's driven by surrounding land use practices, or just the fact that croplands may be naturally more productive, organic, rich soils. But the natural emissions from the wetland don't cause climate change, right? Those are all predate the accounting baseline, and so aren't something that we really need to be managing. So it's kind of like comparing apples and oranges to try and line up those things as a trade-off. I understand the instinct to view wetland methane as being bad or negative, but it is actually just a natural part of our climate cycle, and so shouldn't be seen as sort of a trade-off with wetland drainage. So would increased phosphorus concentrations in wetlands increasing methane be considered anthropogenic? Yes, you could consider that an anthropogenic increase. We are just still trying to disentangle whether or not the increased methane emissions we see in cropland really are related to, say, nutrient inputs from surrounding land, or if it's just different agricultural land suitability that might be driving some of the patterns we're seeing too. And I think that distinction is important for determining whether or not the elevated emissions we see in wetlands embedded in cropland are of an anthropogenic nature or just a natural pattern. Thanks for your questions, Etienne.
And if you do have additional questions after the presentation, please feel free to get a hold of either of John, and he can forward those questions on to Lauren. Or please feel free to contact Lauren directly, and she'll be happy to answer any questions you might have. Again, thank you for attending this month's presentation, and we look forward to seeing you again.
Thanks, everyone.